Welcome to the Shadow of History channel. Be sure to subscribe so that you don't miss out more videos like this one. In Kosovo in 1999, Albanian father Mustafa Jaha, just released from a Serbian prison and forced to cross the border into Albania, anxiously held photographs of his two missing sons, fearing they had been killed amid the brutal ethnic conflict consuming his homeland. A Muhaji of Iran, who earned the title of the world's dirtiest man by going over 60 years without bathing, survived into his 90s eating roadkill and smoking animal excrement from a pipe, convinced that cleanliness itself would be the very thing to kill him. Captured in a single photograph, the faces of American presidents reveal the quiet and unmistakable toll of the presidency, their features visibly aged and weathered by the immense burden of leading a nation before and after their time in the highest office. By 1900, at the Royal London Hospital, an X-ray technician's deeply damaged hand bore silent testimony to the invisible dangers of radiation, as workers unknowingly calibrated their machines each morning by placing their bare hands directly in the path of the rays. In London in 1900, 7-year-old Annie and 1-year-old Nellie sat together on sacking outside their home, 2 of 10 children born to single mother Annie Daniels, in a family already marked by the deaths of 5 of their siblings in early childhood. In the early 1900s, showman Martin Cooney charged visitors 25 cents at his Coney Island sideshow to view premature babies in incubators, and by the time his exhibition closed in 1943, his unconventional mission had saved more than 7,000 young lives. The Swedish warship Vasa sank in 1628, less than a mile into her maiden voyage, resting silently on the sea floor for 333 years before being recovered nearly intact and preserved as the world's finest surviving 17th century warship in Stockholm. Photographed around 1890 in County Clare, Ireland, a mother and her son stood as living survivors of the Great Famine that had struck 45 years earlier, a catastrophe so devastating it reduced Ireland's entire population by as much as 25% through death and mass emigration. On the 23rd of August 1989, 2 million people across Lithuania, Estonia, and Latvia joined hands to form a human chain stretching 675 kilometers, sending an unbroken and powerful message of defiance against decades of Soviet oppression. In Damascus in 1889, a blind Muslim man named Muhammad carried his paralyzed Christian companion Samir, a man with dwarfism, on his back every day, because each man depended so completely upon the other that together they formed one whole life. Standing transfixed before an appliance store window in 1948, a young boy experienced television for the very first time, gazing at a flickering screen that would soon transform how an entire generation of people understood the world around them. Blondie, Adolf Hitler's German shepherd and loyal companion since 1941, remained with him inside the Führer bunker in Berlin's final desperate days, until Hitler ultimately used her to test his cyanide capsules, confirming they worked before his own end came. In Egypt in 1941, Maori soldiers of the 28th Maori Battalion performed the powerful traditional haka during a military training camp, carrying with them into the deserts of a foreign continent the living cultural identity of their people from New Zealand. Towering above the rooftops of Paris in 1886, the Statue of Liberty stood fully assembled for the very last time on French soil before being carefully dismantled, crated, and shipped across the Atlantic to her permanent home in New York Harbor. Following the attack on Pearl Harbor during World War II, a Chinese-American worker in Los Angeles pinned a handwritten sign to his back identifying his heritage. A simple and sobering act made necessary by the fear of being mistaken for Japanese on American streets. Using photographic aging technology to project what they might look like today, this remarkable visual exercise brings beloved and long-departed celebrities back into the present, inviting us to imagine the faces that grief and time long ago removed from our world. Born worlds apart in 1889 and 1878 respectively, Adolf Hitler and Joseph Stalin were once ordinary children photographed in innocence. With nothing in their young faces yet hinting at the catastrophic suffering each would one day unleash upon millions of people. During 1943, United States Marine officer Anthony Joseph Drexel Biddle regularly ordered trainee soldiers to attack him with live bayonets, and disarmed every single one of them, cementing his legendary reputation as one of the most formidable hand-to-hand combat experts in military history. As late as 1918 on the Western Front, a German cavalryman still patrolled behind the lines, carrying a 3.2-meter hollow steel lance weighing just 1.5 kilograms, even as the brutal reality of modern warfare had long since rendered such weapons obsolete on the battlefield. Finnish sniper Simo Häyhä, known across the frozen battlefields of the 1939 to 1940 Winter War as the White Death, became one of the most feared soldiers in history during Finland's desperate and outnumbered resistance against the invading forces of the Soviet Union. Between 1927 and 1948, the humble donut hole quietly evolved through decades of American bakery culture, reflecting how even the smallest and most ordinary foods can carry within them a surprisingly rich and overlooked history of culinary change. Photographed in 1870 by Samuel Carnell in the Hawke's Bay district of New Zealand, and this Maori man bears ta moko, the permanent facial markings that have distinguished the indigenous Maori people for generations as a deeply sacred expression of identity and ancestry. On October 27, 1962, American anti-aircraft rockets stood loaded and aimed over the Florida Straits at Key West, a tense and silent image from the Cuban Missile Crisis, the moment when the United States and Soviet Union came closer to nuclear war than at any other point in history. In the bold and oversized fashion of the 1980s, Finnish band Bogart Co. dressed the way their decade demanded, embodying an era when music and style were inseparable, and every band photograph was itself a statement about the culture that produced it. In 1938, on the Mississippi River, a pearl diver prepared to descend into the murky depths wearing a makeshift helmet fashioned from an old car's gas tank, a testament to human ingenuity and the extraordinary risks ordinary working people accepted as part of daily life. In 1945, Soviet schoolchildren presented the American ambassador with a carved wooden United States seal that concealed a listening device inside, and for 7 years it hung undiscovered in his office, in one of the most audacious acts of Cold War espionage ever recorded. In France during the 1960s, television network logos existed as remarkable handcrafted physical objects, constructed and arranged by human hands before each broadcast, offering a glimpse into the artisanal ingenuity behind the early television industry before the digital age erased such craftsmanship forever. Minted across the years of his reign, the coins issued by Emperor Nero form a rare and intimate timeline, tracking the changing face of one of Rome's most controversial rulers, from the idealism of a young emperor to the hardened features of a man consumed by power. On June 15, 1964, Jimmy Nicol sat alone at Melbourne Airport, waiting for the plane that would carry him back into anonymity, just days after living the life of a Beatle, having filled in for an ailing Ringo Starr across 8 concerts during 10 extraordinary days of worldwide fame. In 1953, the 600-foot-long Marine Angel navigated the narrow and winding Chicago River, a remarkable feat of maritime maneuvering that brought an ocean-going vessel through the heart of one of America's great inland cities. In 19th century Britain, wealthy landowners commissioned portraits of their prize livestock painted with deliberately exaggerated rectangular bodies and enormous mass, using art itself as a declaration of financial power and agricultural dominance in an era when the size of one's animals announced the size of one's fortune. Created in Roman Egypt during the 1st century AD and discovered at Hawara in the Fayum region, this striking double portrait of two brothers stares across 2,000 years of history and is now preserved at the Egyptian Museum in Cairo as a masterpiece of ancient portraiture. Created by the Detroit Publishing Company using the photochrome color process in the late 19th century, these postcards captured Norway's sweeping mountains, deep fjords, ancient glaciers, and quiet towns in vivid color, at a time when most of the world had never seen such landscapes at all. Born in Milan in 1526, Giuseppe Arcimboldo constructed human faces entirely from wolves, cucumbers, books, and sharks, building composite portraits from the world around him in paintings that still astonish viewers today as some of the most inventive and surreal works of the Renaissance era. Between 1890 and 1900, young women on Marken Island in Holland were captured in a photochrome image that preserved both their traditional dress and their everyday world in color at a moment when photography itself was still a young and transformative art form. In 1966, storing just 5 megabytes of computer data required 62,500 individual punched cards and took 4 full days to load. A reminder of how staggeringly different the physical reality of digital information once was from the invisible world we carry in our pockets today. With its swooping interior lines and futuristic cockpit design, the 1986 Oldsmobile Incas represented the boldest aspirations of American automotive design during a decade that refused to be anything other than dramatic in every detail of its industrial imagination. Standing in Mexico City in 1914, Emiliano Zapata embodied the soul of a revolution, a leading figure of the Mexican uprising that reshaped an entire nation between 1910 and 1920, and whose agrarian movement called Zapatismo carried the hopes of the landless poor across a generation. In 1931, on Fifth Avenue in New York City, Winston Churchill was struck by a car after forgetting that Americans drove on the opposite side of the road from Britain, and was carried from a nursing home days later, shaken but resilient as he had always been. On December 17, 1903, just 4 miles south of Kitty Hawk in North Carolina, the Wright brothers made the first controlled and sustained flight of a powered aircraft in human history. And 66 years later, that same dream of human flight would carry men all the way to the moon. Posted beside roads in the 1920s, this speed limit sign trusted entirely in the conscience of passing drivers to obey its instruction, a small and almost charming artifact from an era when the relationship between citizens and authority still left room for the concept of personal honor. French-Italian explorer Pierre de Bravaga, who lived from 1852 to 1905, was celebrated in his era for the exceptional and rare humanity with which he treated African peoples, a legacy so respected that the Republic of Congo chose to retain the name Brazzaville for its capital after gaining independence. Built by Hungarian engineers in Kuwait in 1991 from a Soviet T-34 tank and 2 MiG-21 jet engines, the machine known as the Big Wind was powerful enough to extinguish raging oil well fires with a single directed blast, becoming one of the most extraordinary pieces of improvised engineering in modern history. Taken in Nipomo, California in 1936 by photographer Dorothea Lange, the image known as Migrant Mother captured a woman gazing into the distance, with children pressed against her shoulders and an infant in her lap, and became the defining portrait of an entire nation brought to its knees by the Great Depression. In 1905, in Vancouver, a pedestrian crossed the Capilano Canyon on a bridge stretching 137 meters and hanging 70 meters above the gorge below, suspended between earth and sky on a narrow span of engineering that required both faith in construction and a steady nerve to traverse. Created by a craftsman's hand in 1892, this intricately fashioned fan represents the extraordinary attention to decorative detail that defined an era when even the smallest personal objects were considered worthy of artistry and hours of skilled and patient labor. Between July and November 1916, on the banks of the River Somme in France, the armies of Britain and France faced the German Empire in one of the bloodiest battles in human history, a confrontation preceded by 1.5 million shells in a single week that left more than 1 million men dead or wounded. Still visible on the wall of a church in Dunkirk, France, a dense pattern of bullet holes left from the Second World War preserves in stone and mortar a permanent and wordless record of the violence that swept through this coastal town during one of the most dramatic evacuations of the entire conflict. Burning continuously for over 50 years in the Karakum Desert of Turkmenistan, the Darvaza gas crater measures 69 meters wide and 30 meters deep, and was likely ignited by Soviet geologists in 1971 to stop the spread of methane, earning it the enduring and fitting name of the Door to Hell. In 1988, a young Andrei Agassi appeared in stonewashed denim shorts that perfectly captured the unrestrained and flamboyant fashion spirit of a decade that treated personal style as a competitive sport in its own right, long before his tennis achievements would define his legacy for generations. Conceived by British artist Norman Wilkinson in 1917 and applied extensively to Allied ships throughout the First World War, dazzle camouflage-covered vessels in bold geometric patterns designed not to hide them, but to confuse enemy submarines about their speed, distance, and direction of travel. Designed by Norman E. Timms and unveiled in 1948, the Buick Streamliner was a sweeping and aerodynamic vision of what the American automobile could become, a hand-built concept that pushed the boundaries of post-war industrial design far beyond anything that had come before it on American roads. In 1873, archaeologist Heinrich Schliemann's wife, Sophie, posed wearing the treasure of Priam, a collection of gold jewelry and artifacts unearthed from the ruins of Troy, adorning herself with objects nearly 3,000 years old in one of archaeology's most extraordinary and contested discoveries. Found within the tomb of Tutankhamun was a dagger whose iron blade had been forged from a meteorite, making it a weapon of genuinely extraterrestrial origin, crafted by ancient Egyptian hands from material that had fallen to Earth from the depths of outer space. Queen Liliuokalani ruled the Hawaiian Kingdom from January 1891, becoming its only queen regnant and last sovereign monarch, until the overthrow of her government on January 17, 1893, ending centuries of independent Hawaiian rule and closing one of the most poignant chapters in Pacific history. Photographed in the 1940s, a fresh delivery of Ford vehicles represented not just an industrial transaction, but a glimpse into the remarkable efficiency of an American automotive industry that was redefining how goods, commerce, and mobility flowed across a rapidly modernizing nation. A photograph taken in 1962 at the Faculty of Medicine in Kabul shows two Afghan medical students examining a plaster anatomical cast with their professor, offering a vivid window into an Afghanistan of the 1950s and 1960s that bore little resemblance to the country the wider world would come to know in later decades. Taken in 1847, the only known photograph of the brothers Grimm shows the faces of two men whose collected folktales had already transformed the literature of childhood across the world. Writers whose names became immortal, while the image of their faces remained almost entirely unknown. In Amsterdam in 1929, bystanders and rescuers worked together to pull a horse that had fallen into a canal back to safety, a moment of ordinary urban emergency that speaks quietly to the enduring bond between working animals and the city people who depended upon them every day. Created in 1982 by French-born American artist Armand Pierre Fernandez, Long-Term Parking is an 18-meter tower built from 60 cars embedded in 18,000 kilograms of concrete, a monument that transforms the most ordinary symbol of modern life into a towering and permanent work of art. In 1944, during the Pacific War, the full naval might of the United States fleet assembled for the Marshall Islands campaign, a display of industrial and military power that bore out the warning attributed to Japanese Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto that attacking America had awakened a sleeping giant filled with terrible resolve. Photographed in the United States in 1929, a group of children gathered in conversation with an elderly Civil War veteran, a quiet and extraordinary moment in which living memory stretched directly back to one of the most defining and destructive conflicts in American history. Separated by nearly a century, photographs of Machu Picchu taken in 1915 and 2022 show the ancient Inca citadel of Peru unchanged in its stone and its mountains, a monument to a civilization long vanished that continues to endure against every force of time and nature. By 1936, in New South Wales, Australia, daredevils had strapped motorcycles to the front of chariots and revived an ancient sport once practiced at the Olympic Games, transforming a forgotten piece of classical antiquity into a spectacle of modern speed and barely contained danger. Taken from the air, a photograph of the Great Pyramids of Giza reveals that one of the ancient world's most celebrated wonders stands less than 1 kilometer from the edge of the modern city of Giza, separated from the present day by almost nothing but a breath of desert air. In 1908, photographer and sociologist Louis Hine was hired by the National Child Labor Committee to document the working lives of children across America, capturing, among many others, the young bicycle messengers of several southern cities, whose small figures carried the weight of a system built on their labor. Photographed in 1981, a young Willem Dafoe stood at the very beginning of one of the most distinctive acting careers in American cinema, an unknown face not yet marked by the decades of remarkable performances that would eventually make him one of his generation's most celebrated and mercurial performers. During the Second World War, Allied forces deployed inflatable rubber tanks built on wooden frames and covered with painted cloth to deceive enemy reconnaissance, creating phantom, armored divisions that cost almost nothing but confused and misled an enemy that could not easily distinguish illusion from reality. Captured in daguerreotype portraits between 1840 and 1850, the oldest generation of people ever to be photographed stare back across nearly 2 centuries, many of them born in the 700s, and some having lived through the American Revolutionary War, before a camera ever existed to record a human face. Through rare photographs taken between the 1860s and 1870s, the American West emerges not as myth or legend, but as a real and complicated world of working people, open landscapes, and a way of life that was already beginning to disappear beneath the pressure of a nation expanding westward at tremendous speed. In 1911 in Pennsylvania, Louis Hine photographed children at work in the coal mines, small figures in dark tunnels, performing dangerous labor that no child should have faced, images that would eventually help drive the reform of child labor laws across the United States. Bright, social, and gloriously domestic, a Tupperware party of the 1950s captured a moment in post-war American life when consumer culture and female social life converged in living rooms across the country, turning the selling of plastic containers into a phenomenon that defined an entire era of suburban optimism. On November 13, 1963, photographer Reg Lewis captured a group of young women at a Beatles concert in Plymouth, their faces alive with an emotion that needed no caption, documenting the raw and unmistakable power of a cultural moment that was reshaping an entire generation. One of only two known examples in existence, the imperial passport of Kublai Khan carried not just permission to travel, but an implicit and absolute threat, a small object that represented the full reach of the largest contiguous empire the world has ever seen. Through rare photographs, the Women's Suffrage Parade of 1913 comes back to life as a disciplined and determined procession of women marching through American streets to demand the right to vote, years before the 19th Amendment would finally make that demand the law of the land. During the Battle of the Bulge in 1944, American soldiers discovered lace fabric in nearby homes and wore it as improvised snow camouflage, beginning as a moment of dark humor before discovering it genuinely concealed them from the enemy in the white and frozen landscape of the winter front. Photographed on May 15, 1888, the Eiffel Tower rose steadily above the Paris skyline, still years away from completion, a lattice of iron that most Parisians initially despised, and that would eventually become the most visited paid monument anywhere on the face of the earth. On April 9, 1987, Princess Diana of Wales shook hands with an AIDS patient without gloves, a single deliberate gesture that directly challenged the widespread and damaging belief that the disease could be passed through casual human contact, changing public understanding in a way that no government announcement had managed to achieve. In 1987, 19-year-old Matthias Rust landed his Cessna 172 directly on Red Square in Moscow after flying undetected through Soviet airspace, an act so audacious and embarrassing to the Soviet regime that Muscovites began jokingly calling the square Sheremetyevo 3, after the city's two international airport terminals. Captured in aerial flight in 1948 above Hawthorne, California, the 100-ton Northrop YB-49 flying wing jet bomber offered a vision of aviation so advanced and so far ahead of its time that it would take decades before aircraft designers would fully return to the radical shape it had already mastered. In Hawaii in 1948, fishermen casting their lines from the dark water by the light of lanterns continued a tradition of night fishing that had been practiced across the islands for generations, a timeless image of human patience and the quiet relationship between people and the sea. Photographed in Oregon in August 1939, an unemployed lumber worker and his wife traveled together to find work at the bean harvest, the man bearing a Social Security number tattooed on his arm, a small and telling detail from the final desperate years of the Great Depression. On February 19, 1912, the last horse-drawn fire engine in New York City made its final run, marking the end of an era in which the speed of emergency response had depended entirely on the strength and endurance of animals rather than the power of machines. Crafted during the late Roman Empire between the 3rd and 4th centuries AD, this gold glass medallion from Alexandria depicts a family portrait with a warmth and intimacy that collapses nearly 2,000 years of history, reminding us that the desire to preserve the faces of those we love is ancient and universal. Between 1938 and 1939, the Kindertransport program moved thousands of Jewish children out of Nazi-occupied Europe to safety in Britain, a rescue operation driven by ordinary people who understood what was coming and chose to act, while there was still time to save the youngest and most vulnerable lives. Colorized by Frédéric Duriez, a photograph of captured German prisoners in France from August 1914 transforms a black and white document of early wartime into a vivid and human image, giving faces and color to men caught in the first weeks of a conflict none of them yet understood would last 4 devastating years. Through photographs taken between 1870 and 1880, China's last imperial dynasty appears in rare and intimate detail, offering a glimpse of a civilization still living within ancient structures of power and custom that were already being pressed from every side by a modernizing and expanding outside world. Displayed at the 1964 to 1965 New York World's Fair, the newly debuted Ford Mustang was introduced to the American public as a car that perfectly captured the energy and optimism of its moment, launching one of the most beloved automotive nameplates in the history of the American road.